Hi, I'm James N. Green, professor of Brazilian history at Brown University and co-national coordinator of the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. And this is Brazil Unfiltered. Today, I'm going to interview Sean T. Mitchell, who is professor of anthropology at Rutgers University and the author of Constellations of Inequality, Space, Race, and Utopia in Brazil. I've known Sean for many years, and he's a great guy and one of the foremost experts on the Alcântara Space Station, located in the Brazilian state of Maranhão, which, as you will see in the interview, is highly significant regarding Brazilian-U.S. relations today. Let's go to the interview. Sean, it's really great to have you today on Brazil Unfiltered. Thanks for agreeing to be on the show.
Well, thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here, Jim. I'm grateful for the invitation.
So let's jump right in. Why is the Alcântara Space Center an important issue that merits an in-depth conversation?
There are just so many reasons. I'll kind of list a few that will, I assume, go into depth. It is the hub of Brazil's space program, of Brazil's satellite launch base. There's an accord with the United States. The international politics of it are really complicated, and we'll talk about that. But there's currently an accord which has been ratified in Congress in Brazil. So it's legal for the U.S. use of the base. That is controversial for a lot of reasons. It's an area of Quilombo communities, and there are significant threats to existing Quilombo communities in the region. That's part of the controversy, although there are many kind of international dimensions to it as well. So, in terms of kind of Brazil's place in the world and Brazil's international relations, in terms of Brazil's internal dynamics of class and race, it's a very important site to kind of think about, and the issues there are changing all the time.
Great. So let's locate Alcântara. Where is it? Explain to our listeners and our viewers exactly what the geography is of Alcântara in Brazil.
Sure. It's in the state of Maranhão, which is technically in the northeast. It's the kind of northernmost state that is part of the northeast, but it's also the eastern perimeter of the legal Amazon. So it's really a border region between Brazil's northeast and Amazonian region. It's a peninsula across the bay from the capital of the state of Maranhão, São Luís, which is a city of about 1 million people. It's a wonderful, beautiful area where communities have, over hundreds of years formed a form of, and these are, free Black communities, mostly formed during the period of slavery in Brazil, formed patterns of communal agriculture and fishing and hunting and gathering. Really interesting, fantastic place. And another significant geographical fact, the best place to launch satellites from is the equator. And it's just like 2 degrees south of the equator. There's a satellite launch base used by European space agencies in French Guiana, which is about 6 degrees north of the equator. So it is also an ideal, and for it, there's a deep water port there, relatively stable weather patterns, relatively big city nearby. So it has many features that make it a good spot for satellite launch.
Good. So what about the local population? Can you go back to the colonial period and talk about what you mentioned, the Quilombos, the communities of former runaway enslaved Africans who will live autonomously? Explain to our listeners and our viewers a little bit about what the Quilombolas are, what is the history of Alcântara from the colonial period on.
Yeah, well, it was an area where Tupinambá people lived. Right in the middle of the 17th century, it was kind of made a town by Portugal. But it was, pretty much a backwater for Portugal for a long time. There are early records. Actually, the first recorded account of a Quilombo there comes from 1702. So way back, there were enslaved people from Africa. A Quilombo historically refers to a community of people who had escaped slavery. And, all the way back to the beginning of the 18th century, there are records of Quilombos in the region.
So our listeners understand this. So enslaved Africans would flee their masters and go into the backlands or the hinterlands and build autonomous communities where they would sustain themselves on subsistence agriculture and using the forest as a livelihood. And they would be close enough to towns or populations to be able to raid and to get resources and products if necessary, but far enough away to remain certainly unprotected. So you're saying there was a large number of these quilombos in the region?
Yeah, starting in the 18th century, there are, significant records of quilombos. And one interesting fact, as far as we know, and certainly in the memory of people in the area, these quilombos were never completely isolated. You can take a boat across the bay to the capital city, San Luis, and people, maintained commercial ties across the bay. I mean, I don't know if they were doing it in the 18th century, although it's certainly possible. But there are, people have, there's a significant oral memory about quilombos and ties across the bay. So these aren't communities, they're communities, that were fugitive communities, but they were never completely isolated.
And what was the economic base of production? What was happening? What were the Portuguese producing in this region around this time?
Yeah, so early on, not much. There was some sugar, but as I said, it was really a backwater for Portugal. The heart of the sugar economy was down in Bahia and Pernambuco to the south. It wasn't actually, interestingly, until the American Revolution, 1776. Of course, England is kind of beginning to industrialize around this crucial product, textiles, cotton, and that's when you see. That's when Alcântara becomes a significant part of the Portuguese colonial economy around cotton plantations. So it's not. There was sugar, but it's really cotton. The great Brazilian historian Caio Prado Jr. famously wrote that white cotton turned Maranhão black. And it became this, major site of cotton production. But it was a relatively short period of prosperity, and there was a lot of prosperity, a lot of wealth made, massive importation of enslaved human beings from that period of around 1776 until about 1820. And that's when a period of economic decline, at least, for the cotton producers, began, when Brazilian cotton was not competing with cotton from the United States. And that's the period when we really see massive formation of quilombos by a whole different variety of processes in the region. There are many people who left enslavement, who were, fugitives. There were also people who were left in charge of their land by planters who, abandoned Alcântara or, maybe intended to come back at one point and did not. But so through a variety of means over the course of the 19th century, really starting about 1818 or so, there's a large-scale formation of quilombos in this region.
And what's the relationship of the indigenous population? You mentioned earlier that there were indigenous peoples in the region. How are they interacting with the enslaved Africans or the people who had fought their freedom and had gone in and to form the quilombos? What's the connection between the indigenous peoples and the enslaved Africans and freed Africans?
They form communities together. And, there's a whole kind of ethnic geography of the region in people's own telling. There are communities. There's an interesting one section of the Alcântara coast. People refer to it locally as like Terra de Caboclo. So kind of referencing people of, with significant indigenous roots. There are communities in the region that are seen as more African. Farming practice, people practice rotating horticulture, so slash and burn agriculture, though it's very sustainable. There's a whole set of local rules that people follow so as to not exhaust the land, traditional farming processes. And there's a lot of indigenous technique. The staple carbohydrate is farinha d'água, which is a kind of fermented manioc meal. It's delicious. People eat it with everything. And the techniques of making that, of extracting the poison from the cassava, the manioc that it's made from. They use kind of indigenous chippy cheese. People manufacture them locally. So there's really, the communities are predominantly Black, and today, especially today, I mean, this is, kind of ethno-racial identification has been increasing over the last few decades as Black people, especially younger people, tend to identify as Black. But there's a, deep history of mixture of those communities, of cultural practices, techniques of food production, et cetera.
So Maranhão is producing cotton in the 18th and the early 19th century. And this is cotton that's being supplying Great Britain in their textile revolution. So there's a lot of trade and interaction between the British and Brazil. And then what happens? Why is there this decline? What happens if there's a decline that many masters will abandon the control of their plantations, and there will be a lot more fugitive slaves kind of finding their freedom? What's going on there? I want to understand that a little bit more.
Sure. Well, I mean, the kind of political economy of why U.S. cotton becomes dominant, that's a question that I don't have a perfect answer to. But Brazilian cotton is no longer competing significantly with U.S. cotton by around 1820. Planters are in a lot of debt. They abandon land. There's a whole literature, the wonderful anthropologist Alfredo Wagner Bruno de Almeida, who's done a lot of work in Alcântara and wrote with his team a very significant document that's very important for quilombos in the area and kind of making their claim to be legitimate quilombo communities. He wrote a book, the Ideologia da Decadência, the ideology of decay, decline, decadence, which kind of gets into the actual literature, the historiography of the region. There's a lot of fiction and poetry, which talks about this period of decline, of abandonment. There's a lot of significant fiction written about that, reflecting this idea of decline. But the other side of it, this period of decline was a period of growth. And, contemporary for the Quilombo communities, for people who were able to, now that this place was no longer a significant part of the colonial economy, who were able to form free communities. And contemporary Alcântara, you can see it. There are the ruins of the old slave houses next to, people tending cattle and banana trees and babaçu trees, which is an important part of the babaçu is Amazonian kind of little mini coconut that is important to the local economy for a variety of reasons. So it was a period of decline on the one hand because of, this kind of international political economy, but also a period of growth and abundance in many ways for the residents of the region.
And when I teach the history of Brazil to my students, I show a chart of exports in the 19th century, and there's this big blurb in 1860 to 65. I ask the students what's going on there? And they think a minute or two and they say, the U.S. Civil War. So there is a little mini boom in the 1860s. Yes. Is that right? And how does that affect the region?
Planters come in, some quilombos lose their land, but it's a relatively short period where there's that boom. I mean, there were, again, it wasn't a perfect story of quilombo formation. Alcântara was not just a kind of utopia of quilombos all over this whole period. There were sugar projects in the area. There was this brief cotton boom, but the overwhelming story of the period is the formation of these free Black communities. So let's
understand the history of this space center. What was it originally? How did it become a space center? Tell me the story of how it was formed.
Sure. So, I mean, go back to 1961, actually, under Quadros, the president of Brazil. Brazil formed its space program. And, this is the period of Sputnik and Apollo, and in which these great geopolitical conflicts are, being waged in this most utopian form, the kind of extraterrestrial conquest. And Brazil has longstanding ambitions to be a, major international power. And the space program is spoken of in these terms. Brazil's first satellite launch base is built in the city of Natal. That became limited. They couldn't expand it. It's not that big because of kind of urban sprawl.
Natal was a place in where U.S. troops were stationed during World War II, in order to be a part of the war effort. So that had a large military presence of the United States in World War II. But as you're saying, it wasn't really the best possibility for space launches. And so Brazil chose Alcântara as a space center? Was this something, was a joint project with the United States, or was something that the Brazilians developed on their own?
It was a Brazilian project. I mean, it was actually 1980, so it was the very end of the military regime that ruled Brazil from 64 to 85. That I think the project has its origins in like 79, but it's interesting. It's a period when Brazil was a major arms exporter. Actually, I think right around that period they were the third largest arms exporter in the world. They were exporting munitions to Iraq. And here the U.S. tie. Iraq was, of course, allied to the United States at that time under Saddam Hussein, the Iran-Iraq War. So Brazil had, robust military industries which had been built up during that military dictatorship. They had a lot of cash. They wanted to, build a satellite launch base. They recognized that they had these geographical advantages of being close to the equator. The official story about why Alcântara was chosen is that it's an ideal site. And, in many respects it is. As I said, it's close to the equator, deep water port, stable weather, nearby urban center. I mean, technically, Amapá has, pretty much all of the same features, and it's like right at the equator.
Amapá is a state to the north of Maranhão.
Yeah. So the base could have also been built there. I've heard from a number of people, and I can't confirm this, that the reason that Maranhão was chosen was because the power broker of Maranhão was José Sarney, who ended up under peculiar circumstances becoming the first civilian president of Brazil after the fall of that regime. And he, during this period really controlled a lot, and for a long time, until pretty recently, controlled a lot of Maranhão's politics. And so again, I can't confirm it, although, a number of people within the space program have said this to me, that it was the influence of Sarney that got the base brought to Alcântara. And it was a state governor allied to that military regime that expropriated, on paper, 52,000 hectares for the construction of that base. That was later, there was then a federal decree in 1991, which expanded that area, again, only on paper, expropriated for the base to 62,000 hectares of land. And what they did, there are incredible stories from the period. I mean, they arrived in 1982, I think. And, this was a region, the only electricity was in there's a central town in Alcântara, which people refer to locally as the SEGI, like the headquarters. The central town in Alcântara, which today has, 5,000 people or so. And then the surrounding countryside of Quilombo communities. They arrived in that town. At that time, the only electricity was by generator, just for a couple hours a day. And, there were most of the communities of the interior were not accessible by car. This dense forest in the region. And, here were the Air Force. It was an Air Force project. They showed up promising to build, this technological space station. And the documents from the area, from the time, are really interesting. They talk about, these tribal traditions which are about to fall. And, they talk about how they're going to build something better. They're going to build something modern. It's going to bring development to the region. And there was actually a lot of excitement about it. And they hired 30 young men to be what the colonel in charge of this local project referred to as the first space cavalry in history, because they were trained to go around on horseback in these communities to prepare communities for this big project. They were actually, it's interesting, I interviewed some of these people who were part of that project. They were flown down to São José dos Campos in the state of São Paulo, which is kind of the hub of Brazil's military industrial complex, military industries. And then they found out that they were in the Air Force. They didn't even realize that they were going to be in the Air Force. They were being recruited for this project, and they were trained to go around on horseback and expropriate communities, which is what they did.
Before we return to the interview, I want to ask those of you who can a favor. It's very important to me that Brazil Unfiltered offers regular analysis of the political, social, and economic situation in Brazil, and that the program is free and open to everyone, not behind a paywall, but accessible to all who are interested. As an activist and a scholar, I've worked for over 40 years to increase awareness about Brazil. This is my life work, and I will continue to do it as long as I can. However, producing this program is something I cannot do by myself. We recently created a Patreon account so that eventually I can start to compensate my producers for all they do to make this possible. If you can, please donate to patreon.com/Brazil Unfiltered. Even a couple of dollars a month would go a long way and would help us to continue to come out with new material on a weekly basis. If you're not in a position to donate, no worries, enjoy the program. So in 82, the Brazilians decide they're going to have a space program in 61. It takes a long time for that to happen, but by the early 80s, they've decided to do it. The governor of the state has been allied with the military and will end up being the vice president and then the president of the country in a turn of events, as you mentioned. And then in 82, they decide they're going to actually implement the project. And that entails moving people off the land. So how many people do they need to move? Do they want to move to build the space station?
Yeah, so the first two phases of relocation happen. There's a planned third phase that never happens. And that land for the planned third phase is a lot of what's today contested. The first two phases, it's about 1,500 people or so, and who are moved from these coastal communities. In 1986 and 1987, this happens again with the aid of this local space cavalry. And you can imagine, these are people that got, aunts and uncles in these communities. They're relying, the Air Force is relying on these local relations of kinship, of friendship. These communities are moved in 1986 and 1987. Again,
what do they promise? What does the government do to get them out? Is it just brute force, or do they offer them something?
Yeah, it's a mix. They're promised agrovillas, so agricultural villages, which are in fact built. There are 7 of them. They're inland. It was actually a contentious period. So at the time, the local residents, they don't yet. There's a history of escape from slavery that people talk about in oral memory, but they don't yet consider themselves quilombolas in what becomes the modern sense of taking this on as a political identity. Although again, it's important to emphasize there is both historical documentation and oral recollections of slavery and escaping from slavery. But people are represented at that time by the Rural Workers Union. And, that's an important part of the story. The union mobilizes people. And the point of conflict at the time actually wasn't whether or not people were going to be relocated. It was the size of land that they were going to be allotted. And it's very important to, people's local memory of these events that they were promised a módulo rural, so the kind of like legal minimum amount of land that the government can use for land resettlement. They were promised 30 hectares per family because of actually a blockade that the Rural Workers Union organized in 1986, I think. When this process was just really getting going, they staged a blockade. They won some concessions, including a 30-hectare módulo rural. And it was actually under that same President Sarney, when he was president after the fall of the military regime, that they then abruptly, after making that promise, said that the módulo rural would be 15 hectares. But then, there was also brute force involved, and people were moved to these 7 agrovillas. The agrovillas had, certain things. They had electricity. They were brick houses. People traditionally made their houses out of wattle and daub, kind of, clay from the earth. So, these were nice houses to people. They had electricity. They were also promised technical assistance in farming. And here's where, some of the big problems start for people. The technical assistance was never forthcoming, or, it wasn't sufficient. People were only given 15 hectares of land per family, which simply is not, and it's not great land, simply is not sufficient for the kind of rotating, again, ecologically sustainable, forest preserving farming practices that are used in the region. And so a lot of that land in the agrovillas quickly became over-farmed, leaving people, without access to food resources that they have on the coast. They're also a lot farther from the ocean, which is another significant part. I mean, it's just to tell you, like, I'm this anthropologist from the United States. People know me very well in the region. When I show up places, people, will offer me a meal. I'm very lucky to be able to do this work and to have these close ties in this incredible place. When I'm in the still, existing coastal communities, the food is abundant, and it's like amazing fish. And in the agrovillas, people are kind of scrambling for money to buy a chicken or something to be able to get food. So, the difference in people's kind of food security is really perceptible to me. And this is important to people locally, people who are in the existing coastal Quilombo communities who have been fighting for their land since this period, and, whose land is still threatened, have, robust discourse of local abundance and how they saw their relatives move to these agrovillas who became poor. They're constantly scrambling for food. But, they still live with this, kind of robust and bountiful, at least with respect to food, situation. So the difference is perceptible.
In other parts of the Amazon, I'm thinking of Ecuador, when the government has created new communities for people. They set up a trap in the sense that people get a house and they get electricity, and then they have to pay the electrical bill, and then they have to be in the money economy, and then they get the electricity turned off because they can't pay for it. Is that a problem also in these?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Areas?
I mean, it was really a process of proletarianization for the residents of the agrovillas. They became dependent on meager and sporadic wage labor on the base. I mean, the outcome that many people hope for is that their sons will get into the Air Force when, the Air Force is, military service is kind of nominally mandatory in Brazil. But, people really want that spot in the Air Force. And, it's when a kid gets into the Air Force, often, purchase a motorcycle and have some money. But other than that, there's, meager wage labor available, laying bricks, sweeping brooms, etc. And people are dependent on cash. People would do other things. I mean, people then in the agrovillas, they had electricity. So, they opened little stores. People could go there for a cold beer, which wasn't available in the coastal communities. So there's a kind of local economy, which developed, because of that proletarianization. But that's really the process as you describe it. They became dependent on wage labor in the agrovillas. But, a lot of young people from these communities will, at some point in their life, in their youth, they'll move to San Luis, which is difficult. They end up in neighborhoods where there's a lot of violence and where jobs are scarce. And I don't have numbers on this, but again, just, from interviewing lots of people, it's most of the people who do this from the kind of older coastal Quilombo communities, they, tend to end up back in those communities after living in the city at some point. And a lot of people in the agrovillas do not, because the young people, they don't have land to farm. And so they'll stay in the city, working as maids, working as bricklayers, etc.
So there were two phases of delocation or relocation of people in the 80s. And what happened to the people who managed to stay on the coast, in the beach area?
Yeah. So the base occupies just under 9,000 hectares of land, and that's the area that was expropriated. And people were, as I said, moved in over in 86 and 87 in these two phases, moved to these 7 agrovillas. That base was completed in 1990. There are documents stating that there'd be this to just kind of going north along the coast, this third phase of relocation. It never happened. For a variety of reasons. One, there's a lot of local resistance, and people have, they're quite organized. We could talk about the kind of local political formations. So they've moved to defend their land. The Brazilian space program also, it's never had a lot of funding. It's never had a lot of support. There's a lot of institutional complexity and, conflict. That has, stymied the Brazilian space program for a number of reasons. And so they've managed, through a combination of those two factors to stay on that land. And to, again, they want, they now have electricity thanks to a program of the Lula government, Luz para Todos. This is the Workers' Party government. It was in 2006 that electricity arrived because of this federal electrification program arrived in communities. Of course, they want schooling for their kids. There are a lot of things that they want, but they also want their land and to maintain the kind of, again, farming and fishing and gathering practices, which work very well for them and, frankly, work for the local environment as well.
You mentioned that there's a change in people's understanding of the history of the quilombolas, that there's a notion that, in fact, there is a political value in articulating their origins as runaway slaves communities. Why does that happen? How does that happen? When does that happen?
Brazil's constitution, post-military regime constitution, it goes live in 1988, which significantly is the centenary of the abolition of slavery in Brazil in 1888. And, this is a period of, the kind of reemergence of a lot of political movements in Brazil that had faced a lot of repression during that military regime, including Black movements, which are very important. And those movements managed to get a clause into the Constitution that requires that the state grant inalienable land rights to Quilombo descended communities. And, that becomes really important, all over Brazil, because there are, many traditional communities that have, a legit claim to, some sort of origin as Quilombos. So that's 1988. Nothing really happens at this point. The political representation is still largely through a rural labor's union. People tend to be referred to as rural workers rather than quilombolas. It's really in 1999 that you get the kind of emergence of Quilombo politics, which, by the way, in my book, Constellations of Inequality, I write a kind of ethnography and history of this site in order to kind of do the history and ethnography of the site, which is important on its own right. But I also try to describe and analyze kind of changes to the politics of inequality in Brazil at different scales, both kind of internationally, because the space program is always a project about, inequalities between states and how that's changed and locally. So the book tries to kind of examine these changes to inequality politics at different scales. Really, in 1999, there's one of those individuals who was part of the space cavalry. He spends, I think, 9 years in the Air Force or something after that. Feels a lot of remorse for what has happened and what he's been involved in. Starts going to the Black Cultural Center in San Luis and, becomes radicalized and, returns to Alcântara and becomes an important movement leader in this kind of first generation of Quilombo movement leaders. The involvement. So in 1999, there's a seminar which is held which involves academics, activists, lots of residents from local communities. And it's with that seminar, with the work of some individuals like this person I mentioned, who starts kind of developing. Again, this is a period where there's a flourishing, emerging Black movements in Brazil, and so they give people new discourses, new ways of thinking about their experience in terms of their history, in terms of their racial identity, and these ways of thinking about their experience, they make sense to people. It's not like I say this is important because there's a kind of conservative discourse that said, Quilombo identity is all fake. It's all something invented. No, I mean, it draws on real history and it makes sense to people, but it is something that we can see emerge historically as people, learn to kind of think of themselves in these new ways. And so what then becomes interesting is people, the Rural Workers Union, continues to mobilize. They're very important, but new organizations develop. The MABI, the movement of those affected by the space base, becomes a very important representative of local communities. Again, it's rooted locally. It has local leadership by Quilombolas, and it articulates. Unlike the Rural Workers Union today also talks about Quilombos, but unlike the rural workers at that time, articulates people's experience in terms of their experience as Black, as Quilombolas. Part of that book, Constellations of Inequality, we can see there are things that are happening in other parts of the world as well. This is a period where people's ways of politicizing and thinking about inequality, where there are these forms of identity-based ways of thinking about these things and mobilizing around these things become important to people in new ways around the world. And, we see that kind of process here. But again, I just want to emphasize some people use that. And there's a kind of whole anti-Quilombo network, which uses that fact to say that, these are, again, there's fake communities. And, that's just wrong. This is how, as an anthropologist, I'll say, this is how identity forms. This is how people censor themselves form. This is how political movements form. And it is rooted in, real local experience and history.
Now, I think was one of the things that's important for our listeners and our viewers to remember and understand is that when slavery was abolished in 1888, there were no programs put in place to help former enslaved people find a way to economic equality or opportunities. They were basically thrown out from their enslaved positions into the world without any support in any way, no offering of land or training or education. And so it makes a lot of sense that people will look at these forms of resistance as the cores of what they needed to do to survive on their own. And it sounds like they're using the provision of the 1988 Constitution to demand that the government actually provide this land for them. And so that seems to be what the struggle is today, is to say that the groups of people that the space station wants to remove have the right to have access to land, and those who had their lands promised to them in the 1880s have the right to get more land because what they were given is not enough. Is that right? Is that a good summary of what's going on?
Yes, absolutely, Jim. That is. Those are, have been significant terms of struggle for people over this whole period. And, because of their organization, they've managed to keep that land so far.
So how is the United States involved in this? You mentioned that they signed an agreement. When did they sign an agreement? And what's the importance of this agreement for the struggle for people over land and access to land in Maranhão, in Alcântara?
Yeah, so many ways that the United States is involved in this that we could talk about for a long time more. Some, a number of important moments. So there's, the United States the United States dominates a lot of satellite launch technology. And, as cables from WikiLeaks have shown, has never wanted Brazil to have a successful satellite launch program. And, I think part of that is for military reasons. The ability to launch rockets is also the ability to launch missiles, which, the United States wants to restrict, also possibly for commercial reasons. But there was a deal struck in 1999, 1999-2000, under the administrations of Bill Clinton and Fernando Henrique Cardoso, very similar to the one that was signed again in 2019. And the way in which the politics of these deals has changed, I think, is very revealing for changes in a number of different things in Brazilian politics. But that, the accord, it restricted Brazilian access, so that, the U.S. is going to have areas of the base that Brazil couldn't have any access to. It restricted the use of any money that came from this U.S. deal for the development of Brazil's own launch program. So that deal was signed, but one significant advantage that the deal gave to Brazil is that it's a technology safeguards agreement. So it basically protects proprietary United States launching technology from Brazil and allows it to be utilized at the site without any technology transfer. So Brazil gets to participate and make some money from the space program, but doesn't get technology to advance its own launch program. That deal was signed in 1999. It became a massive issue, and it was very interesting. There was a lot of opposition on both the left and the right on nationalist grounds. And really interesting, one of the most vociferous opponents of that deal on the right was a congressman by the name of Jair Bolsonaro, who articulated that opposition in nationalist terms, right? That this was part of Fernando Henrique Cardoso administration, which was kind of neoliberal administration, selling out Brazil's industrial and military interests to the United States. It's radically different from how Bolsonaro would sound in that respect 20 years later, which is something we could talk about if you want. But there was a lot of opposition. All of the major presidential candidates in the 2002 presidential election opposed the deal. It became an electoral issue. And when Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, Lula, the Workers' Party left-wing president, was elected, he shelved it, and it was finally then rejected by Congress in 2003. That deal that would have allowed this kind of U.S. control of significant parts of the base and probably resulted in expropriation. So fast forward to 2019, a very, very similar deal is signed. There's a lot of opposition to it in Brazil. People write similar articles to those that they wrote at the time, but the right-wing opposition has really disappeared, which I think reflects the kind of decline of a certain kind of right-wing nationalism that was involved. As I said, the military regime invested a lot in these military export industries, and for reasons that I'm not an expert in, though I can speak to it. That kind of like right-wing military nationalism seems to have suffered a decline for whatever reasons, and most of the opposition this time came from the left. The major left-wing parties, the PT, the PSOL, did vote against it when it was ratified in Brazil's Congress, but this deal did end up being ratified. Also significantly, Brazil's Minister of Science and Technology, I forget his full title these days, the astronaut who in 2006, Brazil paid $10 million to send him up to the International Space Station on a Russian rocket. His claim to being an astronaut, Marcos Pontes, promised when the deal was being negotiated and voted on in Congress that there would be no expropriation of Quilombo land. Months after it was finally agreed to in Congress, Brazil kind of released its plan for the expropriation of this land. So that was obviously false. The other thing, again, there's a lot I could say about the U.S. Another significant thing that should be mentioned, Brazil had 3 attempts at the site to launch its own satellite with its own rocket. Brazil, by the way, is very successful at building satellites. There are Brazilian satellites in space. Some launched with the US, some launched with China. Brazil has kind of robust space partnership with China. They have yet, and they've launched lots of rockets, Brazilian-built rockets from the site as well, suborbital rockets. However, they've yet to successfully get a Brazilian satellite into orbit with a Brazilian rocket at the site. There were 3 attempts in 1997 and 98, and then the last one in 2003. The attempt in 2003 exploded on the launch pad 3 days before takeoff. It killed 21 highly trained Brazilian, engineers and technicians and scientists who were working on the rocket at the time. Massive explosion, and the official reports into that explosion, never kind of make a final suggestion about what the approximate cause, what set off the explosion. I've written about this if anyone's interested. And so, of course, in this contentious site, that has generated a lot of different kind of conspiracy theories and accounts of what might have caused that explosion. And one of them, which is always circulated, and I always, as a kind of U.S. citizen who does research in the area, something I always faced is there are many people who think it was sabotaged by the United States. And, so this is a kind of accusation I've had to navigate carefully in my own work.
So is there a possibility that this agreement that was signed under the Trump administration could be abrogated if a new president came to power in 2022 and assumed office in 2023? Or is this a long-term agreement that implies also the removal of the quilombolas?
The legal question about what a new Brazilian president could do, I don't know the answer to that. It's a good question. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not sure what kind of legal recourse. I would say at this point, things could change. There doesn't seem to be the kind of mass political base of opposition to the deal that there was back in 2000 that would, make such a course likely. Although who knows if the PT, if Lula's elected, perhaps he will abrogate the deal. What's important is, so the Brazilian government released this plan. I guess it was, I forget exactly what month, but a couple months after the deal was finally ratified in Brazil's Congress, with plans for relocation of Quilombo communities. There's been lots of mobilization around that, including, here, the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil has kind of assisted local communities and many kind of progressive members of Congress have made statements. And then recently, the Congressional Appropriations Committee, I believe it is, made a statement. And as I understand it, apparently this generally guides kind of State Department policy that no money from the United States use of the base can be utilized for the expropriation of Quilombo communities. So that's a good sign. And that's, again, thanks to, the significant kind of local organization and resistance.
So why should we care in the United States about Alcântara?
Yeah, a lot of reasons. One, because, it's a simple matter of justice. And I think in general, we should care about justice. Two, because, ecologically, these are people practicing, traditional, ecologically sustainable farming practices in a significant, part of the Amazon. Again, it's a perimeter of the Amazon, but it's the Amazon, and this is important for ecological reasons. Three, because the United States has been involved in this process in a lot of ways. I should say I am not at all opposed to Brazil's space program. I wish Brazil to have a successful space program. Investment in that space program by the Bolsonaro and previously the Temer government have been very, very low. So they're kind of counting on making money from this deal with the United States. But because the United States has been involved, we should care about it. I think it's important and this guides my own work as a scholar from the United States, we live in this incredibly, imperial, powerful country that exerts its influence in all kinds of ways around the world, including, I would say, and there's significant evidence, in the non-democratic process that took out the government of Dilma Rousseff in 2016, that put Lula behind bars when he was the front runner in the 2018 elections, paving the way for Bolsonaro to be elected. As the leaked documents of Vaza Jato and Operation Spoofing have shown, the United States was illegally involved in that process. And so, we here in the United States, this process, which has been very, very deleterious to the people of Alcântara and people all over Brazil, I think we in the United States should take that very seriously as scholars, and think about our own ability to have an impact on the policy of our own extremely internationally powerful government.
And one last final question that I ask all the people who are specialists of Brazil and the United States: how did you get involved in Brazil?
Interesting question. So, and this will be more public than I've usually made it. I don't often talk a lot about myself, but I'm actually a second-generation anthropologist. So my dad, William Mitchell, did research in Peru. So I actually spent a lot of time in the Andes as a kid, studied philosophy as an undergrad. And then after a few years, decided I wanted to go to grad school, and decided that anthropology would just be much more interesting than philosophy, because I could kind of do philosophy in the world. It seemed the ability to kind of, answer questions by talking to people seemed better than just being in the library all the time. And so I applied to PhD programs in anthropology, not knowing what I would really do, where I would really study. And I mean, it's, part of the story about the United States. I got FLAS funding. So foreign language area studies, this is US federal funding for, kind of understudied languages. And studying Portuguese paid my rent. And while I was in grad school. And so I started studying Portuguese, and I just became fascinated by Brazil. That, pushed me towards studying Portuguese, but it was my own fascination. Brazil is really, really interesting, especially for someone from the United States. They have, the US and Brazil have such similar histories in so many ways, continent-sized countries with similar patterns of settler colonialism and slavery and aspirations to this kind of international power that run through the two nations, yet, they're so different. So I became fascinated and fell in love with Brazil, and here I am today.
Wow. Thank you so much, Sean, for spending time with us today on Brazil Unfiltered. We're looking forward to hearing more about your work, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Jim. It's been a pleasure.
I hope you're enjoying Brazil Unfiltered. We have lots of exciting things planned for the rest of this year and next. Please tell your friends, colleagues, and students about the program. Follow me on Twitter if you want more frequent updates. The full catalog of Brazil Unfiltered is free and available to all on YouTube and anywhere you can get your podcasts.